The Voltrex Empire was something else. These aliens had conquered half the known galaxy, and their military could crush entire star systems without breaking a sweat. At the top of this massive empire sat Queen Ravenna, a warrior who'd fought her way to the throne and ruled billions of beings across thousands of planets. When she gave an order, entire fleets moved. When she spoke, governments listened. But there was one problem she couldn't solve with all her power and authority. She couldn't control her own kids. 7 of them, ranging from what we'd call 8 to 14 years old. And these weren't just bratty children throwing tantrums. The Voltrex species was built different. Their biology made them aggressive, competitive, and incredibly strong even as youngsters. It was in their DNA to fight, to dominate, to prove themselves through violence. In their culture, this was supposed to be normal, something that got channeled properly with the right training. Except nobody could train these kids. Nobody could even get close to them without ending up in the medical bay. 12 tutors had tried. 12 highly trained professionals from the most respected warrior clans in the empire. Every single one ended up hospitalized. Broken bones, severe lacerations, concussions. One poor guy got thrown through a reinforced window from the 3rd floor. He survived, but he refused to ever set foot in the palace again. The destruction wasn't limited to people either. The children had demolished 3 entire wings of the royal palace. Priceless artifacts destroyed, walls torn down, furniture reduced to splinters. The queen had repair crews working around the clock just to keep the damage from spreading to other sections. Then there was the diplomatic incident. During a state visit from the Corvian Federation, the second eldest prince decided to challenge the ambassador's son to a fight. It started as a typical dominance display, but it escalated fast. By the time guards separated them, the ambassador's kid was in critical condition, and the Corvians were threatening war. It took months of negotiations and massive reparations to smooth things over. Queen Ravenna tried everything she could think of. She brought in discipline masters who specialized in handling violent youth. They lasted a week. She consulted with behavioral scientists who'd written entire books on Voltrex child development. Their theories crumbled when faced with actual royal children who seemed to have no interest in being studied. She even authorized chemical suppression treatments, carefully measured doses that were supposed to calm aggressive tendencies. The kids built up a tolerance within days. Nothing worked. And this wasn't just a family problem anymore. The queen's advisors were getting nervous. These children were heirs to the empire. Future military commanders, planetary governors, maybe even the next ruler. If they couldn't be controlled as kids, what would happen when they had access to actual power? When they commanded armies or controlled weapons that could destroy planets? Meanwhile, halfway across the sector on a diplomatic station orbiting a star called Rigel, a human named Tommy Blake was just trying to make it through another shift. He was a janitor, night shift maintenance crew. Nothing glamorous about it. He pushed a cleaning cart through empty corridors, mopped floors, fixed broken equipment, took out trash. It was honest work, and after his messy divorce back on Earth, he needed honest work. Something simple, predictable, far away from all the drama. Tommy was in his late 40s, average height, starting to go gray around the temples. He wasn't special. No military background, no fancy education. Just a regular guy who'd worked maintenance jobs his whole life and was pretty good at it. He kept to himself mostly, did his job well, and saved his credits hoping to retire somewhere quiet eventually. What Tommy didn't know was that someone had been watching him. The Queen's security chief, a sharp-eyed Voltrex named Commander Thane, had access to surveillance feeds from every diplomatic station in the Empire. He'd been searching desperately for any clue, any solution to the royal children problem. And 3 weeks ago, he noticed something strange in the footage from Rigel Station. The station had a youth recreation area, a place where the teenage children of various diplomatic families could hang out. And like teenagers everywhere, especially teenagers from warrior species, they caused problems. Fights broke out regularly. Equipment got damaged. Station security had to break up incidents almost daily. These weren't the royal children, but they were still difficult, violent, and largely uncontrollable. Except when Tommy walked by. Commander Thane watched the footage over and over, not quite believing what he was seeing. Whenever this ordinary human janitor pushed his cart past the recreation area, things changed. The violent kids who'd been threatening each other moments before would just stop. Not out of fear exactly. They didn't seem afraid of him. They just stopped. Sometimes they'd even help him move his equipment or hold doors open for him. It made no sense. Tommy wasn't imposing. He didn't carry weapons. He didn't give orders or make threats. He was just a janitor doing his job. But somehow, His presence alone calmed these aggressive young aliens in a way that trained security officers couldn't. Thane showed the footage to the Queen. She watched it 3 times, her expression unreadable. Then she made a decision that would change everything. The offer arrived at Tommy's quarters via an armored diplomatic courier, which was already weird. The message was simple but incredible. 1 year of service, working directly for the royal family. The salary listed was more money than Tommy would make in 20 years of janitorial work. Enough to retire comfortably, buy that quiet place he'd been dreaming about, never worry about credits again. The job title was Environmental Maintenance Coordinator for the Royal Children's Wing. Tommy read it as fancy talk for janitor. He'd be cleaning up after the Queen's kids. Rich kids were probably messy, sure, but how bad could it be? He accepted. He needed the money, and 1 year wasn't that long. He packed his few belongings, said goodbye to his co-workers, and boarded a royal transport ship that would take him to the palace. During the journey, Tommy noticed the crew treating him strangely. They were polite, almost too polite. The way people act around someone important or someone they feel sorry for. He didn't understand why until later. Tommy Blake had no idea he was about to become the most important human in galactic politics. He thought he was just going to clean some floors and maybe deal with some spoiled kids. He had absolutely no clue what he was actually walking into, or that his simple approach to life was about to shake the foundations of an entire empire. The transport ship descended toward the palace, and Tommy looked out the window at the massive structure below, completely unaware that 7 violent alien children were about to change his life forever. Tommy Blake stepped off the royal transport expecting to see some fancy palace with maybe a few messy rooms to clean. What he found instead looked like a war zone that somehow happened indoors. The children's wing of the palace was absolutely destroyed. Walls had massive claw marks gouged deep into the metal. Entire sections of corridor had scorch marks from what looked like plasma burns. Furniture wasn't just broken, it was obliterated, reduced to twisted metal and shredded fabric scattered everywhere. Light fixtures hung from the ceiling by exposed wires, sparking occasionally. The floor was covered in debris, broken glass, and stains Tommy couldn't identify and wasn't sure he wanted to. The few servants he saw moved quickly through the corridors with their heads down, practically running. When Tommy tried to ask one of them for directions, the alien just pointed frantically down a hallway and hurried away like the building was on fire. Nobody would make eye contact with him. Nobody wanted to talk. They all acted like they were working in a minefield. Tommy set down his equipment and just stood there for a minute, taking it all in. He'd cleaned up some bad situations before, bars after fights, apartment buildings with terrible tenants, but this was on another level. This wasn't mess. This was systematic destruction. And he was supposed to maintain this place? With the kids who caused this damage still living here? He didn't have to wait long to meet them. Tommy had just started unpacking his cleaning supplies when he heard the sound. Heavy footsteps, multiple sets, coming down the corridor fast. Then they appeared around the corner. All 7 of them, moving together like a pack of predators. The oldest one, a prince named Voss, stood nearly 7 feet tall despite being only 14. He had dark-scaled skin, golden eyes that reflected light like a cat's, and claws on his fingers that looked sharp enough to cut through steel. Behind him came the others, ranging in size but all of them looking dangerous. They moved with this scary kind of grace, spread out to surround Tommy without seeming to plan it. Voss stepped forward, right into Tommy's personal space. He was doing this whole intimidation display, the kind of thing animals do to establish dominance. His crest flared out, making him look even bigger. He showed his teeth, which were very sharp and very numerous. A low growl came from his throat that Tommy could feel vibrating in his chest. The other kids circled closer, cutting off any escape route. This was clearly a test, the kind they'd probably done with every adult who'd come before. They expected Tommy to do one of 3 things: show fear and back down, submit and treat them like royalty, or try to challenge them and establish dominance right back. Tommy did none of those things. He looked at Voss for a second, then glanced around at the destroyed hallway, then back at the prince. He let out a long, tired sigh, the kind of sigh that comes from years of dealing with difficult situations and just wanting to get through the day. "Look," Tommy said, his voice completely calm, "you can rip me apart if that's what you want to do. I'm not going to stop you. But here's the thing, somebody still has to clean up this hallway. All this broken glass and debris is a safety hazard. So if you're planning to kill me, that's fine, but at least let me finish mopping this section first. I don't want the next guy to have to deal with it." Then he just turned his back on them. Completely turned around, putting them behind him where he couldn't even see them. He picked up his mop, dunked it in the bucket, and started cleaning the floor like they weren't even there. The kids froze. You could see the confusion on their faces. In Voltrek's culture, everything was about dominance hierarchies. You established your place in the pecking order through confrontation, through displays of strength and challenges. Every adult they'd ever met had engaged with them on those terms, either trying to dominate them or showing fear. Tommy didn't engage at all. He wasn't scared, he wasn't trying to prove he was tougher, he wasn't angry or lecturing them. He was just mopping the floor like this was a completely normal Tuesday. Voss looked at his siblings, clearly not sure what to do next. The younger ones waited for his lead. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, the kids backed off. They didn't leave, but they stopped the aggressive posturing. They just watched him work. This became the pattern over the next few weeks. The children would try different tactics to get a reaction out of Tommy. They'd destroy something right in front of him, expecting anger or fear. He'd just wait for them to finish, then clean it up without saying a word. They'd try to intimidate him during his rounds. He'd work around them like they were furniture. They'd block his path. He'd politely ask them to move, and if they didn't, he'd find another route and come back later. What really got to them was his complete consistency. Tommy had boundaries, and he stuck to them every single time without exception. He treated his work with respect, even if they didn't. He showed up at the same time every day. He followed his cleaning routine. He maintained the equipment properly. When they asked him questions, he gave straight, honest answers without talking down to them or treating them like dangerous animals. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week. The youngest princess, a girl named Kira who was about 8 years old, had a massive violent outburst. She was the smallest but maybe the most aggressive, always trying to prove herself to her older siblings. She got frustrated with some training equipment and just lost it, tearing into the wall with her claws and throwing things. In her rage, she grabbed a piece of broken metal and it sliced right through her hand. Bright purple blood started pouring out. She froze, staring at her hand. In Voltrek's culture, showing weakness was incredibly dangerous, especially among siblings. The other kids immediately got tense, watching to see what would happen. Kira looked terrified, not of the injury but of what it meant. Her eyes darted to her siblings, calculating whether they'd use this against her. Tommy had been working 2 corridors over, but he heard the commotion. He came around the corner, saw the blood, and just walked over calmly. He didn't make a big deal of it. He pulled out his first aid kit, the standard one he always carried for minor injuries on the job. He cleaned the wound, applied some antiseptic that worked on Voltrek's biology, and wrapped it with a bandage. "Happens to everyone," he said simply. "Caught my own hand on sharp metal last month. Bled like crazy. You'll be fine in a few days." Then he went back to fixing the wall panel she'd damaged, like nothing major had happened. Kira stood there, staring at her bandaged hand, processing what just happened. An adult had seen her weakness and didn't exploit it. Didn't lecture her. Didn't report it to the queen. Just fixed it and moved on. For the first time in her life, she'd encountered an adult who didn't see her as a threat, a weapon, or a political asset to manage. Just a kid who got hurt and needed a bandage. That's when things started to change. The next day, when Tommy came by on his rounds, Kira followed him. Just walked behind him quietly, watching him work. The day after that, Voss joined her. Then the twins. Within a week, all 7 royal children were trailing after this ordinary human janitor as he went about his maintenance routine, watching everything he did with intense curiosity. They didn't understand it yet, but Tommy was teaching them something their entire culture had missed. That there was strength in simply doing good work. That respect could come from consistency and honesty instead of domination. That sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was just show up and be decent. And Queen Ravenna, watching through security cameras in complete disbelief, realized this janitor had accomplished in 3 weeks what the Empire's best trainers couldn't do in years. Queen Ravenna sat in her private office, watching the security feeds for the 3rd time that day. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her children, the same violent terrors who'd sent trained warriors to the hospital, were sitting in a half-destroyed storage room voluntarily sorting screws and bolts into containers while Tommy explained the difference between various types of fasteners. They were paying attention. Actually listening. Asking questions even. The Queen's chief advisor stood beside her, equally stunned. "Your Majesty, I don't understand. He's not using any training protocols. He's not establishing dominance. He's just making them do maintenance work." Ravenna leaned forward, studying the human janitor on the screen. "He's not making them do anything. Look closer. They're choosing to help him." And it was true. Over the past month, something remarkable had happened. Tommy had put the royal children to work, but he never called it training or lessons. He called it helping with the job. And somehow, that made all the difference. Prince Voss, the eldest and most aggressive, had been the hardest case. The 14-year-old had spent his whole life being told he was destined to be a great warrior and military commander. Violence was his birthright, his purpose. But Tommy saw something different when he watched Voss destroy furniture during his outbursts. "You know what your problem is?" Tommy said one day, after Voss had torn apart an antique chair in frustration. "You've got all this strength and speed, but you're using premium tools for cheap jobs." Voss had turned to him, confused and still angry. "What does that mean?" Tommy picked up a piece of the destroyed chair. This chair was 300 years old. Handcrafted. Irreplaceable. And you used your claws on it, which are designed to cut through armor in combat. That's like using a plasma cannon to open a door. Sure, it works, but you've wasted something valuable for no good reason. He handed Voss a piece of sandpaper. "Your claws are precision instruments. You want to learn real control? Start with this. We're going to refinish the furniture you haven't destroyed yet. Teach you what real precision feels like." Voss had looked at the sandpaper like it was an insult. But something in Tommy's tone wasn't challenging him or talking down to him. It was just honest observation. So he took it. And he started learning. Refinishing furniture turned out to be incredibly difficult for someone with Voss's strength. He had to control every movement, keep pressure consistent, work slowly and methodically. The first table he tried to sand ended up with gouges in it because he pressed too hard. Tommy didn't yell or criticize. He just said, "Try again. Lighter this time." It took Voss 3 weeks to properly refinish a single chair. When he finished, Tommy inspected it, ran his hand over the smooth surface, and said 2 words, "Good work." The prince stood a little taller. That simple acknowledgement meant more than any medal or royal commendation he'd ever received because it was earned through actual skill, not birthright. The twins, Dax and Riker, were 12 and inseparable. They did everything together, including fighting. Their favorite activity had been destroying things in competition with each other, seeing who could cause more damage faster. Tommy redirected that competitive energy. "You two like competing?" he asked one day. "Fine. Let's see who can repair wall panels faster. But they have to actually work when you're done. I'll test every connection. Sloppy work doesn't count." The twins attacked the challenge like it was combat. They raced each other, but now they had to be careful, precise, and thorough. When Dax rushed through a panel and it failed Tommy's electrical test, he had to start over while Riker kept working. They learned that speed without quality was worthless. Pretty soon they were teaching themselves advanced repair techniques, studying technical manuals in their spare time, anything to get an edge over each other. The competition was still there, but it was building things instead of breaking them. Princess Kira, the youngest at 8, had always been the most violent because she was trying to prove herself to her older siblings. She was small for a Voltrex, and in their culture, that made her vulnerable. So she overcompensated with aggression. Tommy noticed she had an incredible eye for detail, probably from always having to be aware of threats around her. He put her in charge of organizing the supply closets. It sounded like a nothing job, but Tommy showed her how a well-organized system could save hours of work. How knowing exactly where every tool was could mean the difference between a quick fix and a long project. Kira took to it obsessively. She created color-coded systems, labeled everything, arranged tools by frequency of use and type. Her aggressive precision found a perfect outlet. When her siblings needed something, they started coming to her because she always knew exactly where it was. For the first time, she had power that didn't come from violence. She had something her bigger, stronger siblings needed. The other children fell into their own roles. Prince Thane, 11 years old, turned out to have a gift for diagnostics. He could look at a broken system and intuitively understand what was wrong. Princess Nora, 13, discovered she loved welding, the precision and focus it required. 10-year-old Prince Jorik became obsessed with electrical systems. But what really changed them wasn't the work itself. It was the conversations that happened during the work. Tommy treated their violent impulses not as moral failures or signs they were bad kids, but as engineering problems that needed better solutions. "You got into a fight with the guards yesterday," Tommy said to Thane one morning while they were rewiring a lighting system. It wasn't a question, just a statement. Thane's crest flared defensively. "They disrespected me." "Maybe," Tommy said, not looking up from his work. "But you put 2 of them in medical. Now there's a formal complaint, your mother's dealing with political fallout, and you're restricted to this wing for another month. That what you wanted? They needed to learn respect. Tommy paused and looked at him. Did they learn it? Or did they just learn to be more careful around you? There's a difference. He went back to stripping a wire. Real respect isn't about making people afraid. It's about making them want to listen to you. Those guards? They're never going to respect you now. They're just going to avoid you. Thane was quiet for a moment. So what should I have done? Depends on what your goal was. You wanted them to respect you? Then you had to give them a reason beyond fear. Show them you're smart, capable, worth listening to. You wanted them to leave you alone? Then you ignore them. Their opinion doesn't matter if they're not important to you. You wanted to hurt them? Well, you did that, but now you're dealing with consequences. It was a completely different way of thinking. Tommy was introducing them to human concepts they'd never encountered: proportional response, thinking about long-term consequences, strategic restraint. Not through formal lessons, but through casual observations while grouting tiles or replacing air filters. The palace transformed over the following months. Servants could walk through the children's wing without fear. The constant repair crews were no longer needed. Diplomatic guests stopped filing complaints. The Queen's advisors were baffled. Some whispered that Tommy must be using some kind of human mind control technology. Others thought he was a covert intelligence operative using advanced psychological manipulation. The truth was simpler and somehow more profound. Tommy was just a janitor who believed people responded to being treated with basic decency and respect. He had expectations, sure, but he also recognized effort and improvement. He didn't see the royal children as future weapons or political assets. He saw them as kids with a lot of energy and ability who'd never been given a productive outlet for it. But not everyone was happy about the changes. In the military command center, far from the palace, a group of high-ranking generals watched reports about the royal children with growing concern. These kids were being groomed to be future military leaders. Their aggression wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was the whole point. And this human was ruining everything. The attempted murder was subtle, professional, and completely deniable. Tommy had no idea how close he came to dying that day. He was working in one of the upper corridors, replacing ceiling panels that had been damaged months ago. It was routine maintenance, the kind of thing he did every week. He was up on a ladder, tools in hand, focused on removing the old panel when he heard a voice below him. Tommy, stop. Don't move. It was Voss, the eldest prince. His voice had an edge to it that Tommy had never heard before, controlled but urgent. Tommy froze, hands still on the ceiling panel. What's wrong? Voss was staring up at the mounting bracket that held the heavy lighting fixture directly above Tommy's head. His eyes were moving rapidly, following lines and connections that Tommy couldn't see from his angle. The prince had spent the last 4 months learning maintenance systems, and he was naturally gifted at it. That bracket's been sabotaged, Voss said quietly. Someone cut through 70% of the support beam. It's designed to look like metal fatigue, but the cuts are too clean. If you put any pressure on that panel, the whole lighting assembly comes down. It weighs about 300 pounds. Tommy felt his blood run cold. He carefully, very carefully, climbed down from the ladder without touching anything else. When he reached the ground, his hands were shaking slightly. The other 6 children had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. They did that sometimes now, moving through the maintenance corridors they'd learned to navigate. Kira was already examining the base of the ladder. The twins were checking other fixtures in the corridor. Little Jorik had pulled an access panel and was tracing electrical lines. It's not just the bracket, Kira said, her voice ice cold. The ladder's been weakened too. 3 rungs have hairline fractures. They would have held your weight going up, but coming down, especially if you were carrying debris from the ceiling, they would have snapped. Tommy sat down on the floor, processing this. Someone had tried to kill him. Not in a moment of passion or a random attack, but with careful planning. They'd studied his routines, knew which corridor he'd be working in, and set up an accident that would have looked completely natural. Noro, the 13-year-old princess, examined the cut marks on the bracket with a jeweler's precision scope from the toolkit. Military-grade cutting tool. Plasma-based. The kind special operations use. This wasn't some random person. This was professional. The children gathered around Tommy, and for the first time since he'd met them, they looked truly dangerous. Not the wild, undisciplined violence he'd seen when he first arrived. This was something else. Focused. Controlled. Cold. Who did this? Rika asked, and the threat in his voice was unmistakable. Tommy took a breath, forcing himself to think clearly. I don't know. But we need to tell your mother and security. This is serious. No, Voss said flatly. Not yet. If we report this now, whoever did it will cover their tracks. We need evidence. Real evidence. What happened over the next 2 weeks was something Tommy never could have predicted. The children, the same kids who'd been called feral and uncontrollable 6 months ago, organized themselves into an investigation team that would have impressed professional intelligence agents. They used everything Tommy had taught them, but in ways he'd never imagined. Kira's obsessive organizational skills meant she knew the maintenance schedules for every section of the palace. She could identify which workers had access to which areas at which times. The twins used their competitive nature to race through security footage, cross-referencing personnel movements. Jorik mapped out the electrical and data networks, finding blind spots in surveillance. Voss coordinated everything. Tommy watched in amazement as the prince ran the operation like a military commander, but with patience and strategic thinking instead of just aggression. He assigned tasks based on each sibling's strengths, kept everyone focused, and slowly built a case. They didn't just investigate the assassination attempt. They went deeper. Using the maintenance access Tommy had shown them, they moved through service corridors and crawl spaces that most palace security didn't even know existed. They gathered information, documented safety violations, traced supply chains. What they found was bigger than one murder plot. The generals who'd ordered Tommy's death, the ones who complained he was corrupting the royal heirs, had their own problems. Their military command sectors were riddled with inefficiency, misappropriated resources, and corruption. Ships that were supposedly being maintained were actually falling apart. Training facilities that showed perfect inspection records were dangerous disasters. Weapons systems that should have been upgraded were still running on outdated technology while the budget money disappeared. The children documented everything with the same precision Tommy had taught them for maintenance logs. Photos, video, testimony from lower-ranking soldiers who were afraid to speak up, maintenance records that didn't match actual conditions. They built an airtight case. 3 weeks after the assassination attempt, the royal children requested a formal audience with the High Council. This was unprecedented. Royal children were seen, occasionally, at ceremonial functions. They didn't request audiences. They didn't address the council. But they were within their rights to do so, and the council couldn't refuse. Queen Ravenna sat on her throne, watching her children enter the council chamber. They were nervous, she could tell, but they hid it well. They'd prepared for this. Behind them, Tommy walked quietly. He tried to stay behind, but Voss had insisted. You taught us this, the prince had said. You should see it. The generals were there too, smug and confident. They expected the queen to discipline her children, maybe even send the human away. They had no idea what was coming. Voss stepped forward and began to speak. His presentation was flawless. He laid out their findings methodically, with evidence for every claim. He didn't accuse or rage. He simply presented facts, backed by documentation the council couldn't dispute. When the generals tried to interrupt, Noro calmly pulled up maintenance logs that contradicted their excuses. When they claimed budget constraints, Thane showed financial records proving misallocation of funds. The council chamber fell silent as the full scope of the corruption became clear. These children, these supposedly feral and uncontrollable youngsters, had just exposed systemic failures in the military command structure that council oversight had missed for years. The head general, a decorated warrior named Craven, finally stood up, his face twisted with rage. This is exactly the problem. These children should be learning combat and strategy, not crawling through maintenance shafts like common laborers. This human has corrupted them, made them weak, turned them into technicians instead of warriors. Voss turned to face him directly. General Craven, with respect, your flagship's primary weapons array is operating at 60% efficiency because proper maintenance hasn't been done in 2 years. Your training facility on Orbital Station 7 has structural weaknesses that will cause catastrophic failure within 6 months. Your elite combat unit has a 30% equipment malfunction rate. You call us weak because we understand the systems that keep your military functioning? We're not technicians instead of warriors. We're warriors who understand that logistics, infrastructure, and system maintenance are what win wars. Anyone can break things, General. We learned how to fix them. That's actual strength. The silence that followed was deafening. A 14-year-old prince had just made a high-ranking general look incompetent in front of the entire High Council using nothing but facts and maintenance reports. Queen Ravenna felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Real pride in her children, not for their capacity for violence, but for their intelligence, their teamwork, their growth. But Tommy, standing quietly in the back, was already planning his exit. This had gotten too political, too complicated. These kids didn't need him anymore. They'd learned what he had to teach. It was time to go before he caused more problems. He had no idea that the hardest lesson was still to come, and it wasn't one he'd be teaching. It was one he'd be learning. Tommy packed his belongings that night, moving quietly through his small quarters in the palace. He didn't have much, never did. A few changes of clothes, some personal items, his well-worn tool belt. Everything fit into 2 bags. He'd saved most of his salary over the past year, had enough credits now to retire somewhere peaceful. Maybe a quiet colony world where nobody knew about Voltrek's royalty or galactic politics. He heard the door open behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. 7 sets of footsteps, moving with that careful precision he'd taught them when carrying equipment through tight spaces. "You're leaving," Kira said. It wasn't a question. The youngest princess had probably noticed his change in routine days ago. She noticed everything. Tommy turned to face them. All 7 royal children stood in his doorway, and the expressions on their faces made his chest tighten. They looked betrayed, confused, hurt. Like kids watching a parent walk out. "Yeah," he said simply. "It's time. My contract's almost up anyway, and after that whole thing with the council, it's better if I go. This got too complicated, too political. That's not my world." Voss stepped forward, his jaw set. "We defended you. We exposed the generals who tried to kill you. The council sided with us. You're safe now." "I know, and I appreciate that. I really do. But that's exactly the problem." Tommy sat down on his bed, trying to find the right words. "You kids, you stood up to the most powerful military commanders in the Empire. You took them down using everything I taught you. That was incredible. I'm proud of you. But it also means you don't need me anymore." "That's not true," Nora protested. "There's still so much to learn. We've barely started on advanced electrical systems, and Jorik wants to learn programming, and you can learn all of that from actual experts," Tommy interrupted gently. "I'm just a janitor. I taught you basic maintenance and how to think through problems, but you've already gone way beyond that. You don't need me to keep growing." Thane, usually quiet, spoke up. "Is this about what General Craven said? About us becoming technicians instead of warriors? Because we're not weak. We proved that." Tommy shook his head. "No, you're not weak. You're stronger than ever, and smarter too. But that's the thing, you're royal heirs to an empire. You've got responsibilities, a future that's way bigger than maintenance work. I was useful for a while, helped you get control of yourselves, but now you need to move on to real training. Leadership, strategy, diplomacy. All the things future rulers need to know." The children were quiet for a moment. Then Kira, the smallest one who'd once been the most violent, asked a question that cut right to the heart of everything. "You taught us how to fix things," she said, her voice steady. "So how do we fix this?" Tommy looked at her, confused. "Fix what?" "This situation. You leaving. Us not being ready. You think we don't need you, but you're wrong. We need to convince you to stay, or we need to figure out what we're actually ready for, or we need some solution that works for everyone." She crossed her arms. "You always said every problem has a solution if you break it down into parts and think it through. So help us think this through." And there it was. Tommy realized in that moment that he'd been doing exactly what he tried to teach them not to do. He was reacting emotionally, making assumptions, not actually thinking the problem through. He took a breath. "Okay. You're right. Let's break it down. What's the actual problem here?" Voss started pacing, the way he did when he was working through something complex. "The problem is that we're caught between 2 worlds. The generals and the traditional faction think we should be pure warriors. They see everything you taught us as a distraction from our real purpose. But we know that understanding systems, infrastructure, and how things actually work makes us better at everything, including leadership and military command. And Mom's stuck in the middle," Riker added. "She sees the value in what we learned, but she's also got political pressure from the military establishment. They're already grumbling about the generals we exposed. So the real problem isn't whether you stay or go," Nora said slowly, thinking it through. "The problem is proving that what we learned has real value for our future roles. We need to show that this isn't just kids playing with tools. This is actually important for governing and military leadership." Tommy watched them work through it, bouncing ideas off each other, building on each other's thoughts. This was what he taught them, breaking down complex problems into manageable pieces. And they were doing it without his help. What if we formalize it? Thane suggested. Not as a royal tutor thing, but as an actual program. Prove that understanding infrastructure and systems should be part of leadership training for all young Voltrex, not just us. The twins looked at each other, that weird twin communication thing happening. Would need a proposal, Dax said. Something concrete with goals and outcomes, Riker finished. Over the next 3 days, Tommy watched something remarkable happen. The children developed a complete training program proposal, designed for young Voltrex across the Empire. It combined traditional warrior training with practical system knowledge, showing how understanding logistics, maintenance, and infrastructure made for better military commanders and administrators. They included real examples from military history, showing how battles were won or lost based on supply lines, equipment maintenance, and infrastructure control. They cited the very corruption they'd exposed in the general's commands as proof that leaders who didn't understand systems could be manipulated by those who did. The proposal was brilliant. Detailed, practical, and backed by solid reasoning. They presented it to the High Council themselves, and this time, they didn't need Tommy there for support. The Council approved it as a pilot program. The exposed generals were quietly reassigned to positions where they could do less damage. And the Queen made an offer to Tommy that surprised everyone. Not Imperial Consultant. Not Royal Tutor. She offered him a simple maintenance contract. He'd stay on as Palace Facilities Manager, a training position. The royal children would serve as his apprentices 1 day per week, helping with actual maintenance work while continuing their other studies. The rest of his time was his own. Tommy thought about it for exactly 10 seconds before accepting. It was perfect. He got to keep doing the work he actually enjoyed, the kids got to stay grounded in practical reality, and he didn't have to deal with the political nonsense full-time. Years passed. The royal children grew up, took on real responsibilities. Voss became a military commander whose forces had the best-maintained equipment and supply chains in the Empire. Nora revolutionized shipyard operations. Thane developed new diagnostic systems that saved countless lives. Kira created organizational protocols that were adopted across multiple star systems. But every week, no matter how busy they got, they showed up for their maintenance shift with Tommy. Sometimes they brought their own kids along. The next generation of royalty learned to change air filters and repair electrical systems alongside their parents. Historians would later debate what changed the Voltrex Empire's approach to leadership development. Some credited innovative education theory. Others pointed to political evolution and the exposure of military corruption. But the people who were actually there knew the truth. A middle-aged human janitor named Tommy Blake had taught the future rulers of an empire that real strength wasn't about domination or violence. It was about understanding how things worked, fixing what was broken, and showing up every day to do honest work. Tommy eventually did retire, 20 years later than he'd originally planned. He had more money than he'd ever need and a legacy that would last generations. He moved to that quiet colony he'd always dreamed about, a small place where he could tend a garden and fix things around the neighborhood just because he enjoyed it. He still got messages regularly from the royal family. Voss asking advice on supply chain logistics. Nora sending photos of her kid's first successful repair job. Kira requesting his opinion on organizational systems for disaster relief operations. Tommy answered every message the same way he'd approached everything else in his life. Honestly, practically, and with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that the universe mostly came down to showing up and doing good work. Even if that work involved a mop, a wrench, or just teaching some kids that being strong meant knowing when to use that strength and when to hold back. He taught 7 violent alien children how to fix broken things. In return, they taught an entire empire that maybe the most important things to fix weren't machines or buildings, but attitudes, assumptions, and the way people saw strength itself. Not bad for a janitor who just wanted a quiet retirement.